She stood still after a slap that stunned a courtroom. But what came next shook the country. Corruption. Cover-ups. A hidden network targeting black youth. Naomi Keller turned her pain into proof and lit a fire they couldn't contain. This isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a revolution in motion. Let's follow along together. The sound of the slap cracked through the Eastwood City courtroom like a silent gunshot. It didn't just leave a red mark on Naomi Keller's cheek. It fractured the faith of an entire community in what was supposed to be justice. Naomi, 39, a black congresswoman from District 7 and a former civil rights attorney, didn't flinch after the blow. She didn't touch her face, didn't step back, didn't say a word. She stood upright in her charcoal gray suit, eyes locked on the man who had just struck her. Officer Darren Holt, 44, a celebrated figure within the Eastwood Police Department, lauded more than once for his dedicated service. She had come to Eastwood that day to attend Jalen's hearing, though the city lay far outside her jurisdiction. She'd heard the story of a boy named Jalen Moore, 15 years old, arrested outside a car wash for allegedly smashing a window, even though no one had seen him do it. No video, no witnesses, and, most glaringly, no lawyer. The boy had been held in a cell for nearly 20 hours before he was allowed to call his mother. Naomi had gotten word from an old friend in the Juvenile Rights Network. This isn't right, they'd told her. They're trying to bury it before anyone notices. She didn't need more than that. Naomi came to Eastwood quietly. No entourage, no cameras, no press release. Just herself, a thin folder of documents, and eyes that missed nothing. She wore no badge of office, carried no title, just a woman who had stood in countless courtrooms as a civil rights lawyer, now sitting quietly as a witness. She had planned to take a seat in the back of the courtroom and observe the closed-door hearing for Jalen. But just 5 minutes in, her gaze found Darren Holt. He stood near the prosecution table, tall, square-jawed, with eyes like cold steel. Naomi didn't know his name then, but her instincts told her this was the man who had arrested Jalen. And the way he looked at her, not curious, but wary, confirmed it. No one expected Naomi's presence to enrage Holt to the point of violence. But truthfully, Naomi did. Men like Holt couldn't stomach women like her. Black women who didn't bow, who didn't fear authority, who wouldn't shrink to keep the peace. That morning's hearing involved Jalen Brooks, a 15-year-old accused of vandalism after being picked up near a shattered grocery store window. The defendant was absent, recovering and holding with a cracked rib and deep bruises around his eyes. Representing the prosecution, Lieutenant Darren Holt, the officer who had made the arrest. He stood tall at the witness stand, radiating smug control, broad-shouldered, buzz-cut blonde, with dead, unblinking eyes that seemed too familiar with violence. Naomi had seen his type before. She had faced dozens like him throughout her career, but not all of them lost control the way Holt did today. The hearing had lasted less than 10 minutes when Naomi rose to her feet. Her voice rang clear across the courtroom, though she hadn't been granted permission to speak. I have evidence that this officer violated arrest protocol. Jalen was unarmed, and I have video showing he was assaulted after being handcuffed. A ripple of whispers swept through the courtroom like a sudden gust. The presiding judge raised a hand to restore order, but no one was paying attention anymore. Every eye was fixed on Naomi. And Holt, he was boiling. He stormed off the witness stand, striding furiously toward her, ignoring the attempt of counsel to stop him. "You have no right," he bellowed. Naomi didn't move. She stood like a steel pillar in the middle of the courtroom. She didn't back away. She didn't speak another word. And then, in full view of over 40 people, beneath cold fluorescent lights and the frantic pounding of the judge's gavel, Darren Holt struck her across the face. The slap cracked through the courtroom like a whip across silence. Naomi's left cheek turned red, but her body did not waver. Her eyes stayed open, no flinch, no shock. Just stillness, a stillness that chilled the air. A courthouse security officer rushed in between them. Naomi remained exactly where she stood. "She provoked me," Holt shouted, face flushed, breath ragged. The judge shouted for him to be removed from the courtroom immediately, but the effect of that slap could not be retracted like an administrative order. The room froze. A lawyer dropped a stack of papers. A stenographer stared blankly at their keyboard, fingers stiff. Judge Valeria Chun, mid-sentence, stood slack-jawed. No one moved. No one knew what to do. No one could believe what they had just seen. No warning. No scream. No provocation. Just a slap, raw, sudden, and carrying the full weight of fury forged in a system that had never welcomed people like Naomi as equals. Naomi did not respond the way people might have expected. She did not yell. She did not rage. She held still. Her silence made the room shrink, heavy with an unnamed pressure. Because her silence wasn't fear, it was judgment. Before Holt was escorted out, he stood upright as if he had just carried out a sacred duty, but his eyes wavered, scanning for validation among his peers. The prosecutor, anyone. No one returned his gaze. Even those who had once defended order lowered their heads. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Naomi remained still. But within that stillness roared a storm compacted, ready to sweep away the dust caked over truths long buried. In that moment, she was not just a woman assaulted. She was living evidence of a system that had hit moral bottom. A few reporters in the back row scrambled for their phones, hands trembling, not because they were scared, but because they knew they had just witnessed something that shattered the boundaries of daily news. Naomi adjusted her collar, not to hide the red mark, but to remind everyone she was still standing, steady, unshaken, when the court officer approached, not to protect her, but to assess the situation. She didn't flinch. People waited for her to shout, to demand an arrest, to react in any way, but she only said 2 words. Not yet. They weren't a retreat. They were a warning, because Naomi Keller hadn't come to court that day seeking justice for herself. She came to observe a hearing marred by injustice. A 15-year-old black boy, Jalen Moore, arrested without evidence. But with one slap, she became the center, an ignition point from which the entire mask of the system would begin to peel away, layer by layer. No one in that courtroom would forget the moment, not because of the sound of the strike, but because of the silence that followed. A silence that forced everyone to ask themselves, which side am I on? And so the story began, not with a speech, but with a slap, and a silence louder than any accusation. Naomi Keller didn't leave Eastwood after the slap. On the contrary, she stayed, not as an elected official, but as a living witness to a system cracking under its own weight. No one who saw her that day could forget the image of her standing motionless, as if the world had just exploded, and she remained unmoved at its epicenter, solid as stone. But that strength didn't come from instinct. It was forged in pain. Years earlier, Naomi hadn't been a public figure. She was 25, fresh out of Howard Law School, still carrying a wound that hadn't even begun to scab. The death of her younger brother, Malik Keller, 17 years old, just off shift at a corner store. Malik was stopped by 2 police officers for fitting a description. For hours later, Naomi saw him in a hospital bed, his head bandaged, face bruised, breath shallow. Malik never woke up. There was no video, no witnesses, just a cold report stating no wrongdoing found. One officer was temporarily reassigned. The case closed within 3 weeks. Naomi never received an apology. She said many times that day didn't push her away from pain. It pushed her through it. She didn't study law just to practice it. She studied it to dismantle every excuse the system had ever used to justify violence. She didn't go to Capitol Hill to change her tie. She went to change the balance of power. She lost her brother to silence. This time, she wouldn't let anyone else lose their voice. After the slap, the media exploded. They called her a victim, a symbol, an inspiration. But Naomi rejected every label. All she knew was this: the earthquake she just triggered wouldn't be calmed by a speech or a press release. And more importantly, she knew this was only the beginning. Naomi Keller didn't wait for formalities. She began the investigation that very night, back at a small hotel on the edge of Eastwood's downtown. She sat on the floor of her room, laptop open, files spread out around her like a general reconstructing a battlefield, what she'd witnessed in that courtroom. The slap without explanation, the hollow eyes of Jalen's mother, wasn't a random outburst. It had structure, And Naomi always knew, where there is structure, there are cracks. She filed immediate requests for every document related to Jalen's arrest. The Eastwood Police Department's incident report, duty logs, patrol car dashcam footage, and any available surveillance from the area that night. The Records Division responded slowly, sending over a few misprinted pages, then claiming system errors. Naomi wasn't surprised. This was a classic move: delay, frustrate, and bury the truth under administrative dust. But Naomi was not one to walk away. She called an old friend from her days as a civil rights attorney, Vincent Duval, now a judicial data analyst in D.C. "I need you to trace the digital footprints. Anything they tried to delete, they left tracks." Vincent agreed. Within 6 hours, he sent her a trove of system logs. Naomi combed through every detail. The arrest warrant for Jalen was filed at 9:42 p.m., but GPS logs from Officer Darren Holt's cruiser showed he entered the area near the convenience store at 9:18. That was 24 minutes off-grid, with no dispatch report. Surveillance footage from an uncut file showed Jalen standing outside the shop, waiting for a friend next to his bicycle. No vandalism, no broken glass, no commotion. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. That familiar sensation crept back in, a cold fury crawling across her skin, just like the night her brother Malik had been beaten unconscious by 2 officers for matching a suspect description. Malik was only 17 then. Naomi clenched her fist. The next morning, she marched into the Eastwood Police Department, documents in hand, and requested to speak with the head of internal affairs. She was denied. They claimed there was an ongoing internal investigation and advised her not to disrupt administrative order. Naomi smiled. That kind of smile only those who've learned to wield the law like a blade can give. "I'm a federal congresswoman, and I practiced law for 14 years. If you don't give me access to these records, I'll file an emergency motion with the federal court by noon. The choice is yours." 3 hours later, she was assisted. The printed files were thick, but from the first page, Naomi could smell the rot. A signed statement claimed Jalen Moore voluntarily waived his right to counsel. The handwriting, a shaky, uneven scrawl, looked nothing like that of a 15-year-old. The interrogation records lacked video. Dashcam footage marked inoperable precisely during the suspect encounter. But the dirtiest piece was a handwritten note in different ink. "File incident under disturbance. Possible Northview gang affiliation." Naomi slammed her palm on the desk. Jalen, a kid waiting for a friend outside a store, had been turned into a potential gang threat in just a few strokes of a pen. That afternoon, Naomi met Jalen's mother again in a cramped third-floor rental apartment in Birchwood. The woman sat on the floor, clutching her son's hoodie, still damp with the scent of teenage sweat. "I just want to know why my baby is being held," she said, eyes red-rimmed. "They say he resisted, but he's only 15, Ms. Keller. He hasn't even learned how to protect himself." Naomi didn't say a word. She simply placed a folder on the table. A side-by-side signature analysis, a timeline log, surveillance screenshots. Then she looked the woman in the eyes and said quietly, "I won't let this be buried." It was already dark by the time Naomi Keller returned to her hotel room, just half a mile from Eastwood City Hall. She had just wrapped up a late working session with her legal team. Case files on Jalen Moore's arrest slowly exposing a pattern of discrepancies. But it wasn't any of those files that stopped her cold at the door. It was an unmarked envelope slid under the frame, sealed with a strip of silver duct tape. She picked it up. Only one line was scrawled across the front in rough black ink. "We need to talk. M." Naomi tore it open with caution. Every instinct of a lawyer who had stared down powerful enemies switched on. Inside were pages of printed documents, unmarked, untitled. But within the first few sheets, Naomi already knew what she was holding. Internal emails between police officers, disciplinary reports removed from public record, and most damning, a system log showing Officer Darren Holt had accessed the court database to delete an assault complaint 4 months ago. The victim? A teenager named Rico Davis. The case? Handled internally. Naomi closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Someone inside the system had chosen to stand on her side. The next night, In a dimly lit cafe tucked behind Eastwood Central Library, Naomi met the sender, Marcus Bledsoe, 31, a clerk at the district court. He wore a gray hoodie pulled over his head, eyes constantly scanning the room. Naomi walked straight to his table, sat across from him, and didn't waste time. "It was you, wasn't it?" Marcus nodded slightly, his voice barely a whisper. "I've seen too much get buried." He told Naomi about all the times he'd witnessed files go missing, cases that never made the docket, midnight search warrants signed without judicial oversight. They all had one thing in common. They involved a special police unit called the Regional Support Division, commanded by Darren Holt and quietly backed by Chief Inspector Raymond Burke. "There's a network here," Marcus said, gripping his coffee cup. "This isn't just Holt. This is structured. It's a model that's been running for at least 3 years. And I don't think Holt's at the top." Naomi sat in silence, a chill crawling up her spine. Everything she had feared, a protected enforcement ring embedded deep within the justice system, was beginning to take shape. "Why trust me?" she asked. Marcus met her gaze. "Because you weren't afraid. That day, you stood still after Holt slapped you. You didn't strike back. You didn't walk out. You made everyone sit in it. That wasn't weakness. That was strategy." Naomi nodded. "Do you have anything else?" Marcus pulled out a small black USB drive, taped to the bottom of a paper cup. Internal files, duty rosters, audio from a closed-door meeting between Burke and senior command. "But you have to be careful. I think they know I took it." Naomi took the USB and slipped it into her coat pocket. She knew that from this moment on, Marcus was no longer safe. 3 days later, just as Naomi was preparing a formal petition to the Office of the Federal Inspector General, an emergency text lit up on her phone. The sender, Taylor, one of her legal aides. The message was only 10 words. Marcus was in an accident, critical condition, in the ER. Naomi froze for a few seconds. Accident? That evening, she rushed to the hospital. Marcus lay unconscious, his skull fractured, arms shattered beyond recognition. The preliminary report claimed he had slipped on the courthouse steps. But when Naomi reviewed the blurry, conveniently glitched surveillance footage, she knew this wasn't a fall. It was a warning. That same night, Naomi ordered her team to fully digitize the contents of the USB. She uploaded encrypted copies to 3 separate cloud storage systems and sealed a hard drive in a secure location. She couldn't let what happened to Marcus be in vain. What began with Jalen's arrest had now led to a trail of forged warrants, silent judges, and the political shielding of names that still hadn't shown their faces. But in that darkness, Naomi Keller came to a sharp realization. This wasn't just a fight for one wrong teenager. It was a fight for an entire generation reduced to statistics. And she wasn't stopping. Not long after Marcus disappeared from Eastwood, Naomi Keller found herself staring at a new wall, one she had already begun to suspect from the hazy memos and unsigned emails. Gregory Vance, Chief of Police, Eastwood, a man the press hailed as the bedrock of the community. 3 consecutive terms. No public scandals. Silver hair always perfectly parted, uniform always crisp, voice deep and sure like a freight train cutting through fog. But Naomi knew men like Vance didn't stand on integrity. They stood on the rubble of buried truths. The information Marcus provided had led Naomi to a string of internal affairs clearances, where every complaint against officers ended with the same familiar phrase, insufficient evidence. Vance's name appeared at the bottom of each summary, sometimes just a signature, other times a single line, approved for internal resolution. There had never been a real investigation. Naomi didn't wait for an invitation. She went to see him. His office was perched on the top floor of the Eastwood Police Department. Glass walls, plush carpet, and a panoramic view of the city square like a king surveying his dominion. When Naomi entered, Vance stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, watching the city like a general selecting his battlefield. "Representative Keller," he said, without turning, "I assume you're here about the little drama playing out lately." Naomi didn't smile. "I'm here for Jalen, for Marcus Bledsoe, for a system under your command where people disappear and evidence gets wiped from the record." Vance turned, eyes steady as stone. "You think you can bring down this city with a few pieces of paper and some shaky whistleblower confessions? Naomi stepped forward and placed a printed page from the confidential files onto his desk. "I don't need to bring down the whole city," she said calmly. "I just need to rip the mask off your face in front of the public." A faint smirk crept across Vance's lips. "You're mistaken," he said smoothly. "I don't wear a mask, Keller. You've just been looking in the wrong direction." And that was the moment Naomi understood. Vance wasn't merely covering up crimes. He was the architect of them. He didn't just stand behind Darren Holt. He stood in front, clearing the path for SLAPS that landed like verdicts and for children to be criminalized without proof. That night, Naomi received an anonymous call. A raspy male voice said, "If you think Holt is the end game, you'll die halfway there. Don't come for Vance. He doesn't play by the rules." Then the line went dead. But Naomi wasn't afraid. Not because she was fearless, but because she had already lost her family to men in uniform no one dared to question. The next morning, she held a press conference on the steps outside Eastwood Police Headquarters. No theatrics, no slogans, just Naomi, a microphone, and a thick file bearing the department seal. "Police Chief Gregory Vance," she began, facing a dozen cameras, "has knowingly protected a system of abuse for over a decade. I have documents, witnesses, and enough evidence to prove he actively concealed, destroyed, and manipulated internal investigations to shield officers like Darren Holt." The final sentence slashed through the city's silence like a blade. Within hours, Vance held his own press conference in response, a 10-minute speech denying every accusation, calling it a political smear campaign designed to undermine those who uphold public order. But his eyes no longer carried their former steel. They held something new. Unease. Then, another crack appeared. Naomi received an anonymous email to her personal inbox. It contained only one line. "If you really want to make him afraid, look into Miguel Turner's death in 2012. The file is sealed." But Marcus wasn't the first to disappear. Naomi froze at the screen. That name, Miguel Turner, a 16-year-old black student, declared missing after being detained during a minor riot in the city square, right beneath Vance's office window. This was no longer a personal battle. It was an operation, a mission to expose a network of power that had rotted from its roots. And Naomi knew, to win, she would need more than evidence. She needed light, light from truth, from witnesses, from public reckoning. And now, she had found the first crack in the stone fortress Gregory Vance had built. Now came the time to widen it into a fracture that could never be sealed. What Naomi didn't know was that a counterstrike had already been launched, and it had her name on it. A message arrived at 2:14 a.m. No number, no words, just a spliced video from Naomi's hearing, overdubbed with jeering and edited footage that made it look like she was threatening law enforcement. At the bottom, flashing text read, "This woman is a danger to America." Naomi shut off the screen, but her hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the tide of anger rising in her chest like a storm surge. This was the first strike. She knew, and it would not be the last. The next morning, Eastwood 4 News aired a special segment. Congresswoman Naomi Keller accused of abusing power to interfere with state judicial process. A man claiming to be a former aide from her office stood on the steps of City Hall and read a prepared statement, alleging Naomi had once threatened a judge and coerced a witness. Naomi sat in her office, back straight, eyes locked on the screen. Jordan, her chief aide, slammed a palm against the desk. "That's a blatant lie." "And that's why it works," Naomi replied, her voice strangely calm. "They're aiming for emotion, fear, doubt. They don't need proof, just a whisper of suspicion." Within 3 days, #KellerScandal was trending across social media. Doctored images of Naomi appeared everywhere, superimposed over protest scenes, tied false claims of anti-police extremism. Major networks began to ask, is Naomi Keller too radical to represent Eastwood? Even some of her former allies in Congress began to fall silent. The same colleagues who once praised her campaign now offered no comment. Big donors reevaluated partnerships. Her scheduled appearances were canceled one after another. The local radio station declined to air her public service statement on judicial reform, citing a need to avoid controversy. But that was just the visible tip of the iceberg. The following week, one of Naomi's key protected witnesses, a systems technician who had helped uncover the tampering in Jalen's arrest files, was hit by a car while crossing the street. He survived, but suffered 2 broken ribs and short-term memory loss. Police ruled it an accident. That same day, another witness, Clarice, a high school teacher who provided an audio recording of police administrators coordinating with school officials to bury Jalen's record, suddenly recanted her statement. In a recorded video, she appeared with tear-streaked cheeks, saying she had misunderstood the situation. Naomi received the news while attending a small town hall at St. Andrew's Church. She nodded once, eyes briefly closing, then stepped up to the pulpit. I know you're hearing a lot right now. They'll say I've gone too far, that I'm divisive, that I want to tear down the system. But let's be clear, what am I really doing? I'm not tearing anything down. I'm bringing light to the shadows they've hidden for decades, and that terrifies them. The crowd was dead silent. Then a smattering of applause. Then more, louder, stronger, like waves crashing ashore. That night, Naomi returned home to find her security camera at the front door had been smashed. The lock was untouched. Nothing was missing, but Naomi understood the message clearly. We can get in anytime we want. Naomi looked around her apartment. Old photographs of her and Malik, her late younger brother, still hung on the wall. One showed Malik at 16, draped in a GED graduation gown, his hand raised high, grinning ear to ear. Naomi's gaze softened, but beneath it, steel burned hot. This is an old tactic, she said. I've lived through it once, after Malik's death. They tried to scare me with loss, with isolation, but I didn't come here to be liked. I came to break the silence. Jordan stepped forward, handing Naomi a hard drive, a full backup of everything from Marcus. We still have weapons. Naomi took it, gripping it like she was holding on to belief itself. Even as her reputation was smeared, even as she was branded a troublemaker, even as former allies turned away, Naomi kept going. Because truth doesn't need to be liked. It just needs to be seen. She sat in silence in her office, the glow of the computer screen casting tense shadows across her face. The data from Marcus's drive was beginning to reveal something monstrous, a covert youth enforcement operation functioning under the guise of a community outreach initiative. In reality, a well-oiled machine of institutionalized oppression. She uncovered records on a unit called the Youth Intervention Task Force, YITF, established 3 years ago on the banner of reducing juvenile crime. But internal documents told a different story. The YITF had been conducting unlawful arrests, detaining minors in unlicensed facilities, and fabricating documentation to legitimize its actions. Naomi arranged a meeting with a former YTF member, Elijah Reed, a one-time police officer who had resigned after witnessing the corruption from the inside. Elijah recounted, "They told us to detain any kid who looked like a risk. Didn't matter if they'd done anything. Wandering the streets after curfew was enough. They called it prevention, but it was just control." Determined to gather proof, Naomi and Elijah planned to infiltrate one of the YTF's hidden detention sites, disguised as a youth counseling center. On a night soaked in rain, they slipped into an aging building on the outskirts of Eastwood. Inside, they found dozens of boys locked in cramped rooms. No beds, no light, no contact with the outside world. As Naomi filmed the conditions, a YTF patrol unexpectedly arrived. A frantic chase unfolded through narrow, darkened hallways. Elijah was apprehended, but Naomi narrowly escaped through a back exit. Before losing her connection, she managed to upload the video footage to social media. The clip spread like wildfire, igniting public outrage. Media outlets couldn't look away. Under intense pressure, local authorities announced an official investigation. Still, Elijah remained in custody, charged with unlawful entry and interference with official operations. Despite the threats and smear campaigns, Naomi refused to retreat. She held a press conference, revealing the full scope of YTF's abuses and calling for immediate international human rights oversight. "We cannot stay silent while children are treated like criminals simply for being poor or black," Naomi told the crowd. "It's time to end this system of oppression. Just as dawn broke over Eastwood, Naomi Keller stood outside the federal courthouse, her hand gripping a black briefcase containing more than 300 pages of legal documents. No press, no speeches, no banners. Just one 39-year-old woman, carrying the accumulated outrage of an entire community, walking into the gray and white building like she was stepping into the rotted heart of the system itself. Inside the briefcase was everything she and her volunteer legal team had compiled over the past month: internal records, encrypted data, sworn testimonies from whistleblowers, and most importantly, evidence proving that the Eastwood Police Department didn't just harbor violent officers like Darren Holt. It upheld, recycled, and concealed them through a system designed to protect itself. The lawsuit didn't just name Holt. It called out Police Chief Gregory Vance, 3 deputy chiefs, and 7 investigators tied to the Youth Intervention Task Force, a covert unit operating under the guise of community support. Naomi named them one by one, attaching case numbers, email transcripts, time-stamped arrest log alterations, and video footage previously deleted and now recovered. She filed a complaint at 9:17 a.m. 12 minutes later, Eastwood shook. The media exploded. Naomi Keller sues entire Eastwood police system for abuse of power and civil rights violations. The news spread like wildfire, pulling in national outlets that had previously avoided the story due to political pressure. But now, there was no ignoring it. The 328-page lawsuit, made publicly accessible online by Naomi's legal team, became the most downloaded legal document in under 24 hours. Thousands of citizens from across the country sent letters of support. Some even submitted new evidence tied to similar cases. The war had officially begun. At Eastwood City Hall, the air froze. The mayor's office was swarmed by reporters. The police department's media room released a terse statement denying all allegations and accusing Naomi of exploiting the situation for personal political gain. But what stood out the most was the eerie silence from Gregory Vance. The man who used to appear 3 times a week on local broadcasts had vanished from public view. At Naomi's office, the phones rang constantly. Some calls were congratulatory, others threatening. But the most significant came from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They wanted to meet, not to warn, but to talk. 2 days later, inside a small room on the 3rd floor of a federal building in Washington, D.C., Naomi sat across from Agent Julian Merritt, a short man with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as razors. He didn't mince words. "Ms. Keller, we've been watching what you're doing, and I'll be blunt. If you keep bringing the evidence, we may open a federal investigation. But if you back off now, this will disappear, just like 100 other cases that were buried from the inside." Naomi looked at him, her eyes unwavering. "I didn't start this to walk away. And I didn't file that lawsuit so the system could decide whether or not it feels like investigating. I filed it so people could see we will not stay silent anymore." Julian nodded, then opened his briefcase. Inside was a document Naomi had never seen before, a 2018 internal report on the manipulation of Eastwood's crime statistics, signed by Vance himself. Naomi skimmed the header, then looked up, voice calm but weighty. "Then let's begin." On June 12th, in the main chamber of the Eastwood Federal Courthouse, the public hearing led by Congresswoman Naomi Keller officially began. The event was broadcast live nationwide, drawing millions of viewers from across the country. Naomi stepped up to the podium, the lights illuminating her resolute face. She opened with a voice that was clear and firm. "We are here today not just to listen to testimony, but to confront truths that have been hidden for far too long." The hearing stretched over 3 full days, with dozens of witnesses taking the stand. Among them was Elijah Reed, the former YTF officer who had once been arrested for trying to expose the truth. He testified, "We were ordered to detain any kid labeled as a risk, even if all they did was walk home after curfew. They called it prevention, but it was just systemic suppression." Then came the testimony of Clarice, the high school teacher who had once provided an audio recording of a conversation between the police department and school officials about Jalen's case. She stood in front of the chamber and said, "I stayed silent too long because I was afraid. But today, I can't do that anymore." The emotional climax came when Naomi directly confronted Officer Darren Holt, the man who had slapped her in open court. She looked him in the eye and asked, "If I were a white woman, would you have dared to strike me?" The question echoed to the silent chamber, then rippled outward through every major media outlet. It became a headline seen across the country, sparking a renewed debate on racial bias within the justice system. After the hearing concluded, a wave of support for Naomi surged across the nation. Thousands gathered outside the federal courthouse, holding signs that read "Justice for Eastwood" and "We Stand with Naomi." Naomi stepped onto the courthouse balcony, gazed down at the crowd, and said, "This is not just my fight. It's ours, and we won't stop until justice is done." The federal courthouse in Eastwood was packed when the judge read the verdict. Each word rang out clearly through the microphone. Defendant Darren Holt is hereby sentenced to 12 years in prison for abuse of authority, falsifying official records, and violent conduct in the execution of duty. There was no applause. No one stood to celebrate. But Naomi Keller, seated in the front row, eyes locked on Darren, felt something shift deep within the system. A fracture had become a fault line. Darren's face stayed expressionless, but his clenched fist betrayed a tremor he couldn't suppress. His badge was gone. He no longer stood atop the law as a figure of power. Now, he was a convicted man, stripped of protection and exposed to consequences. Outside the courthouse, human rights groups held up banners. Justice doesn't stop at one sentence. That same day, Gregory Vance announced his resignation, citing personal health reasons. But within the halls of power, everyone knew the truth. He had struck a deal to avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for testimony and the release of internal records to the Inspector General's office. Media outlets covered the resignation with clipped headlines, but those who had followed the case knew Eastwood's biggest pillar of corruption had finally crumbled. In the following 3 weeks, 14 senior officers within the Youth Intervention Task Force were suspended. 3 of them were indicted for falsifying records and concealing evidence. Federal prosecutors ordered the reopening of over 30 cases involving black and brown youth previously detained under the unit's operations. All digital records from Vance's tenure were sealed for forensic review. Naomi didn't appear on television. She declined all interview requests. When journalists called, her aide offered a single line. Congresswoman Keller is currently working with her legislative advisory team on a criminal justice reform bill. While the nation fixated on her, Naomi chose to step out of the spotlight. She spent her time at community meetings across Eastwood, listening to parents recount how their children had been detained, threatened, and quietly released without explanation. She sat for hours with law students, dissecting the loopholes in oversight policies and building new frameworks for independent accountability. She visited Jalen Moore, the boy who once sat in a courtroom with his head bowed, now preparing to enroll at a technology-focused high school. His handwritten thank you note stayed tucked inside her wallet. The downfall of Holt and Vance was just the surface. Naomi knew the machinery of injustice still had hands in city councils, prosecutors' offices, even the congressional halls where she herself once spoke. But now, she wasn't alone. The Shield of Truth Coalition, founded by young lawyers inspired by her case, began to expand into other states. Cities like Greenville, Albany, and Sacramento launched hearings modeled after Naomi's public inquiry. Naomi became a symbol, yet in her heart, the image that grounded her was still the cold hand of her brother Malik on that terrible night when she was just 22. Every step she had taken since was part of a journey she never imagined would end with a verdict, because justice doesn't end. It begins again each day in silence broken by action. One early fall evening, Naomi stood on the steps of Eastwood City Hall, watching as a long line of residents arrived for a community forum. A young girl took the microphone, her voice trembling. "I want to be a lawyer to protect people like Jalen." The room erupted in applause. Naomi didn't smile. She simply nodded, eyes slightly red, because she knew the story had spread, and the next generation was picking up where she left off. No one handed her the victory. She seized it, not through power, but through persistence, not through fame, but through resolve. And she knew this fight would continue until justice was no longer an anomaly in a courtroom, but the norm. 9 months after the hearings that shook the nation, the name Naomi Keller had become a symbol for a generation unwilling to stay silent. But she didn't stop there. The collapse of protection racket in Eastwood had sparked a national awakening. In Chicago, a group of young attorneys filed to reopen 76 cases involving suspected misconduct by the Tactical Police Unit. In Atlanta, a wave of petitions forced the mayor's office to release disciplinary records of officers under complaint. In Sacramento, a 17-year-old girl launched an online campaign demanding surveillance cameras in all police interrogation rooms. They called it the Keller effect. Naomi hadn't asked for that label, but she understood its weight. If the system had trembled from just one question she asked, now she needed to turn that tremor into law. And so, the Naomi Keller Act was born, a 130-page legislative proposal drafted by her and her advisory team throughout the summer. Its two primary pillars were the mandatory recording of all interrogations at any police station receiving federal funding and the establishment of a nationwide, publicly accessible disciplinary record system for officers with credible violations. No more broken cameras. No more lost audio files. No more sealed misconduct records. Naomi declared at a Capitol Hill press conference unveiling the bill. The public has a right to know, and the system must be accountable. From the outset, the bill faced fierce backlash from police unions across the country. They called it an attack on the honor of law enforcement. Some conservative lawmakers accused her of pushing radical reforms. But Naomi did not back down. Instead, she brought the truth into the light. She organized public hearings, invited survivors of unrecorded interrogations, people who had been coerced into confessions, who were threatened, who had lost loved ones because no camera had witnessed the questions. She presented data. 87% of internal misconduct complaints were dismissed due to lack of video evidence. Nearly 40% of officers accused had at least 3 prior incidents on record. Naomi's voice wasn't one seeking glory. It was a voice of someone who had lived it, lost through it, fought through it, and now carried thousands of untold stories with her. In time, the groundswell of support grew. Human rights organizations rallied behind the bill. People previously disillusioned with politics began writing to their representatives. Even a few veteran officers spoke out in favor, believing that transparency might just save the institution from imploding. After 3 months of intense debates, amendments, and negotiations, the Naomi Keller Act passed the House by a narrow margin. A month later, the Senate followed suit. The president signed it into law in a ceremony that was quiet, but profound. On stage, Naomi gave no speech. She simply stood, eyes fixed on the rows of families who had lost children, lost justice, the ones who had turned grief into action. The law didn't erase every problem, but it drew a new line. It made truth harder to bury. And more than anything, it proved that sometimes, to change a system, you don't need to destroy it. You just have to force it to look in the mirror. Naomi didn't write the law to see her name in history books. She wrote it so that no one else would have to begin their path to justice with a slap like she once did. It wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning, and the start of a road where no one would be forced into silence again. Afternoon light spilled through the windows of Naomi Keller's congressional office, casting a golden hue over her desk like the day's final whisper. Outside, the sounds of Eastwood hummed. Traffic, laughter from the community center across the street. Inside, only the soft hush of a closing chapter. Naomi stood for a moment before a corkboard lined with handwritten letters. Slanted script, smudged ink, shaky lines. Letters from mothers, high school students, quiet civil servants, all people who once believed they had no voice, until she taught them how to use it. She didn't keep plaques or press clippings. What she kept were lived stories. Her story had never been just about a slap in a courtroom. It was a first strike against a system that once seemed immovable. And as the dust cleared, people no longer saw a congresswoman. They saw themselves. They saw that courage could live in silence. That truth could echo, even when no one wanted to hear it. When the Naomi Keller Act became federal law, she declined the celebration plan for Capitol Hill. Instead, she quietly returned to Eastwood, sitting in the back of a community discussion at a local public high school. The speakers that day weren't politicians or lawyers. They were young people who had once been failed by the system, now brave enough to share their truth. Naomi listened more than she spoke. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew it no longer rested solely on her shoulders. The greatest thing she could leave behind wasn't a law. It was a fire, a small, persistent flame that had passed through each person, each generation. When a 15-year-old girl with wild curls stood up and said, "I want to be a civil rights lawyer because I saw her stand strong, and now I believe I can too," Naomi gave a small nod. No speech needed. Every time someone walked into a room of power and said, "I see wrong and I won't be silent," she knew she had chosen the right path. Not long after, Naomi quietly submitted her letter declining to run for re-election. No press release, no public message. She left the way she arrived, steady without spectacle, because what mattered wasn't staying in front, but that so many others had learned how to stand. She didn't leave behind a statue. She left behind a way forward. And from that point on, the voice no longer belonged to Naomi Keller alone. It belonged to a generation. People unafraid to speak the truth, who understood that justice doesn't come from power, but from courage. No one remembers exactly when Naomi's story ended, because in truth, it never did. It simply changed hands. And in every city, every courtroom, every heart, that story is still being told. Not to honor one person, but to remind us all that change is possible. And sometimes, it begins with someone who dares to stand still in the storm.